G'day, higher level IB Psychology students. Paper 3 should be your easiest exam for IB Psychology, but most students make some really basic mistakes which cost them marks. So in this video, I'm going to explain how you answer the first three questions, question 1A, B, and C. This is worth 9 marks in total, and it should be easy marks. So first, I'll explain how you answer these questions, then we'll figure out how best to study for the exam, and I'll finish by giving you some of my best tips. Warning, I might get a little bit grumpy as I rant and rave about how this paper is marked. So remember, in paper 3, you're given a study that you've never seen before, right? That's the surprise in the exam. What isn't a surprise, or should not be a surprise, are the questions that you're asked about that study. These are always going to be the same, especially these first 3 questions. We'll talk about question 2 and 3 in the next videos. But question 1A, B, and C will always look exactly the same. What changes is the study. So question 1A asks you to identify the research method used in the study and to outline 2 characteristics of that method. It's worth 3 marks. So you get 1 mark for correctly identifying the research method and 1 mark for each correct characteristic that you give. So that answer should be really straightforward. The research method they used was, one characteristic is, another characteristic is. That's all you have to write. I would recommend also though just using one detail from the stimulus to help your answer to show that you're not just memorizing. For example, if it was an experiment and you talked about experiments have independent and dependent variables, well maybe you'll just mention what those were from the study that you are writing about. Or if it was a correlational studies, right, look at 2 covariables, maybe in your answer here you'll just mention what those covariables were. This might not even be needed, but I think it's best to include it just to be safe. It's maybe 1 extra sentence. So if you're writing more than 4 or 5 sentences for this answer, I think you're writing too much. Be concise. Now 1B is asking the exact same thing but about a sampling method. You identify the sampling method and 2 characteristics. Now the sampling method will be one of 5 particular choices. If it was a qualitative study, it was probably a purposive or a snowball sample. If it was a quantitative study, it was probably a volunteer, also called self-selected, a convenience, aka opportunity, or a random sample. So it's going to be one of those 5 specific sampling methods. So just like in 1A, you need to know 2 characteristics of that particular sampling method. And again, I'd also recommend just using 1 detail from the stimulus to show you're not just memorizing and regurgitating rote learned answers, but you're using the material that you've been given. Now 1C is the most difficult. By now, hopefully this is an easy 6 marks. This one should be at least an easy 1 or 2 marks. 3 is a little harder, but what you have to do is state an additional or alternative research method. So simply, you'll get 1 mark by stating a relevant method that could be used. Give 1 characteristic of that method and 1 really good reason why it could be used in this particular study. Now, actually, it wouldn't hurt even just to give 2 reasons, right? If you've got the time and you can think of 2 reasons for an additional or alternative research method. All right, hopefully that makes sense. You can find example answers in our revision textbook and on the blog. I recommend getting some past papers to practice, but now you know what has to go in the answers. We can figure out how best to prepare. Right, for 1A, you need to know the specific research methods that could be the right answer and 2 characteristics of those methods. Now, the research methods you need to know are in the guide, page 32. Let me try to put it here. And so you'll need to know 2 characteristics of those methods. If you've got our revision book, it's in there. I'm sure your textbook has 2 characteristics of the methods. If you've got a different textbook, the best way I think is to use flashcards. If you've got our IB Psychology flashcards, they're all in here. But actually the best way to learn this stuff is to make the flashcards for yourself. Simply put the research method on one side and 2 characteristics on the other. Maybe a third just to be safe. So preparing for 1A, just use those flashcards and memorize the characteristics of each of those particular methods. Same advice for 1B. Get those 5 sampling methods, put the sampling method on one side, 2 or 3 characteristics on the other, and make sure you can remember those. This is 6 marks out of 24 for paper 3. It should be a gimme. Now for the additional methods, it's going to be one of these methods you've already revised here. So there's no additional content. But what I would recommend is just have 2 or 3 that you've got ready to go as a pre-prepared answer in case you get stumped on exam day. So you could pre-write a generic answer about why an observation might be useful or why an interview might be useful, like what's the benefit of focus groups or participant observations or correlational studies, and have that pre-prepared to go here for 1C. I'll give some more tips about this in a moment. Okay, so that's how to answer and that's how to prepare. Where I see students going wrong is they're not being concise and specific, right? So they don't have the correct details here. And also, sometimes students are going into way too much detail. It might, for some of you aiming for 7s, you might be surprised at how simple the answers to these questions really are. So be concise and be accurate. Another tip, use at least one detail from the stimulus for all 3 of these questions. 1 is enough, don't go beyond that. Okay, but let me go into more detail about tips for 1C. Now you can talk about an additional or an alternative research method. Okay, let's think about this for a moment. An alternative. Are you really going to be able to come up with a good reason why they shouldn't have used the method they did and you're going to have an alternative? That's pretty tricky. That's really difficult to do. So I would suggest going with the additional research method. Triangulation is one reason why it's always a good idea to do a second study. Now I wonder what happens if they do a case study. How do you do an additional method to a case study when a case study is a combination of methods? All right, that's tricky. I'm thinking out loud. But that's why it's good to have a generic answer ready to go in case you get a curveball like that on exam day. Now, my other bit of advice would be that it's much easier often to explain qualitative methods as an additional method as opposed to experimental research. A lot of students struggle to explain experiments and correlational studies clearly, and actually to explain how and why you would use these in that particular in the particular stimulus or in response to a particular stimulus is quite tricky. So focusing on qualitative, like observations and interviews, I think would be the best approach. All right, finally, here's a question for you. What about the experiments? Do you have to know the different types of experiments? Now, a common question in IB psychology exams is, in paper 1, sometimes you might be asked, evaluate 2 research methods. And people say, well, are field experiments and true experiments 2 methods? Now, in IB assessment for paper 1 and paper 2, experiments are 1 method. So if you are asked about an essay in paper 1 or 2 about research methods, let's say you're asked about 2 methods, experiments only counts as 1, even if you talk about all the different types of experiments. So you'd have to have experiments and correlational studies. Okay? Now, in paper 3, they're considered separate methods. So, for example, in May 2019, the question was identify the research method like it always is. Now, the correct answer in the marking guide that they suggested was true experiments. Now, if you put a field experiment like I would have done if I was doing the exam, I would have got 0 marks for that. But if you just had the generic response experiment and didn't specify what type, that would have been acceptable. So my advice in the exam is if you know it's an experiment, but you're not sure which one. Is that a field or a true experiment? I don't know. Even though in paper 1 and 2 they are different methods, in paper 3 it's okay to say experiments is the method. Now, what are 2 characteristics of any experiment? Well, they have independent variables, and researchers try to control the extraneous variables so they can deduce causal relationships. They can study cause and effect. That's the purpose of an experiment. It's what distinguishes it from a correlational study. So that's my advice if you think it's an experiment. Now, another common question is, will the research methods itself be actually mentioned in the stimulus material? So in the summary of the study, will they say semi-structured interview? Will they say quasi-experiment? Well, like I just said, in May 2019, they didn't. We had to figure it out for ourselves. That's pretty tricky. In other past papers, they have. So look for it really carefully. Try to find one of those specific research methods in the summary. Look 2 or 3 times, and then if you can't find it, then figure it out for yourself. Another common error is students identify the research method as being quantitative or qualitative. You must identify a specific research method beneath each of those categories. So it's not enough to say it was qualitative method, you'd have to say the type of observation or the type of interview they used. Same with quantitative, experiments, correlational studies, or surveys. Now you know how to answer the questions, how to study, you're ready to do some practice paper 3 questions, so check the description for links to a blog post which explains all of this, and if you scroll to the bottom, you will find some past paper 3 practices on our blog to go ahead and practice and get some feedback from your teacher. If you've got any questions, if you need something re-explained, please leave a comment, but I hope that was helpful. Good luck.